Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to make a video about these and some initial impressions about these particular swords, which are pieces, review samples from LK Chen, which were sent my way to do a review on. And this video primarily is to solicit some advice from fellow sword friends out there, prospective buyers namely, of various LK Chen swords. What could I do as a reviewer, as a person that shows swords on camera, to help you understand if these are or are not worth your hard-earned money? And that's really the purpose of the reviews. But as a person unfamiliar with Chinese martial arts, Chinese swords, Chinese history, all of that kind of stuff, I don't necessarily know the best way to showcase these or how they might be helpful in your martial arts practice, collection, or this, that, or the other. I can show some high-res video footage, and I can ramble on about what I think about the build quality, which I will do regardless of what you say. But it would be helpful to know what facets, what features, what bits and bobs are most important for you as a prospective buyer about these swords. What measurements could I take? What tests could I do? That type of stuff. Now, I have some idea, as I do with just about any swords, but my focus tends to be Japanese swords, Filipino swords, or European-style swords, and this will be a first for me with various types of Dao. Now, one of them, this one right here, is a little bit more familiar to me, but it's still very, very different. Anyway, any advice that you could throw out would be much appreciated. As for the moment, I'm going to go over the swords that were sent. I believe there's a couple more on the way, actually, and I'm just going to show you some things that I immediately notice about them and give some initial impressions while I wait and hope that I get some feedback from more knowledgeable swords friends out there about what would be helpful to see. The first one I'm going to show you here is the Heavenly Horse Dao, and so much of these weapons are tied to historical pieces that are products of their time, and I am just not great at history, even for the swords that are more my specialty. It's just a facet of their usage that I get a little lost on, and or rather, I'm certainly interested in, but I'm not articulate enough to tell you about it in a factual or reasonable way. So this one, from my understanding, is from a time primarily used on cavalry, at a time where the stirrup wasn't invented, and that may have a part in how it's designed and used and all of that kind of stuff, which isn't something I'm going to be able to replicate because I don't have a horse. The closest I could get would be, I don't know, sitting on a skateboard or something like that. Anyway, I digress. The plastic is on here. I was pretty enamored actually by the plastic. I thought it was a very good way of securing the sword. I cut it here so I could take the sword out. You don't necessarily tune into this channel to hear about sword plastic wrapping, but as a supply chain dork, I thought this was a very good wrap. Anyway, there's some silk cord on here. One thing I immediately noticed about the scabbard is that these brass bits are inset both here and at the end of the scabbard, but you're probably more interested in the sword itself, and this sword looks like a dainty, whippy little thing, and it actually feels like it has a presence in the hand. Now, you might be able to see it bounce if my camera participates here. It has some flex to it, but realistically, it's pretty thick at the base here in the sword, and it has distal taper, which is something that you're going to see on all of these LK Chen swords. They actually have some understanding that distal taper is important. Now, I say that because very often sword manufacturers will start at this thickness and end pretty much at that thickness, and it's a facet that I imagine takes time and labor and energy and therefore money to execute, and so it just gets overlooked, and it leaves oftentimes swords. Not that every sword that doesn't have distal taper is bad. Some of them are intended to have that, but there's a lot of swords out there that should have them and don't, and it leads to a clubbish type sword, or a sword that doesn't feel like a weapon. It feels like a reproduction or something less than the historical piece that it's drawing inspiration from. This one feels like a weapon. I say that as a person with zero experience in Chinese martial arts, apart from a Tai Chi class I may have taken in college. I don't know how this sword is supposed to feel, but it does feel like it was built with intent, and it feels like a weapon. Also, there are some interesting metallurgical effects, which is something quite common on the rest of the LK Chen swords. You can see that there are some, let me see if I can get my camera to participate with me a little better here. How can I show this? There we go, that's a good angle. So there's some pretty cool metallurgical effects happening here, and the folding on the steel is good. All the welds seem tight. Whatever steel they're using, it seems as though they're doing a pretty good job with it. I can also make out some of the folding pattern on the back. You can see that fold kind of runs all the way through. Anyway, the shape of it has a very pronounced kind of bevel. It's not a secondary bevel though, it's just the bevel goes immediately to the edge, and so it's quite thick in this part of the sword and then immediately bevels off. It also has some semblance of being hollow ground, but it's very, very faint, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this. Hopefully later in the review I will get a better view. Now, this one is particularly long, and as I look at it, there's a reasonable amount of rippling in the surface, but underneath here it looks like to keep the blade light, there's a very subtle hollow ground that runs all the way up to the tip. It's subtle, but I imagine it removes some of the lightness, or contributes to the light feeling that this blade has. Anyway, it's got a tip on it that there's no pronounced kind of Japanese style tip or anything like that. It seems to have the same type of polish all the way through, and this bevel just gently tapers off. I wouldn't call any of these swords particularly sharp, and that's one thing. So it's sharp enough where I could kind of run my hand along the sword without fear of cutting myself. Oh, actually I just cut myself. No, kidding, I didn't. But a little bit. It's sharp-ish. So the execution on the tip is quite good here, I think. Anyway, it doesn't swell out or anything, though historically I don't know what this sword is supposed to be. I have to say that the sword looks kind of like a dainty little stick, and it doesn't necessarily feel that way. It feels lively, and it's more rigid than I would expect it to be. Let's see, flex-wise, it has some flex to it, but it's, yeah, more rigid than I would expect. One other side note that I want to touch on, all of the swords that I'm seeing from LK Chen have similar types of build quality, so hopefully, even if I'm not reviewing the sword that you happen to be buying, that this review will give you some idea of what to expect were you to buy something from LK Chen. I talked about the packaging, but one small thing as I open the box that I appreciate is that the swords don't smell like machine oil or fish or anything bad. They have some oil on the blade, which odor-wise smells, I don't know, like some sort of wood or incense or something. It's a pleasant smell, and that is something maybe small, but I've opened a lot of swords, and a lot of times they'll use wax that's hard to get out of the scabbard, or will muck up the blade or something and leave residue on it, or they'll use some sort of machine oil that just has an odor which is less than pleasant. This is musky, but pleasant, I would say. Okay, the next one I want to show you is the Dragon Sparrow, and kind of as a highlight, you can see the casting on this little pommel area here. This is an interesting sword, and I don't know historically what this is supposed to be. It seems almost like a sword cane, but it doesn't have the mounting fixtures to be that way. It's like a Chinese-style Zatoichi blade, except for it's nothing like that, and from thousands of years before that happened. So anyway, I do have to say, initially, kind of initial impressions on the casting quality here, it's okay. The ledges on here could likely be crisper, but overall this is not a bad execution or presentation at all, though I'm showing it to you. You'll be the judge. I know that LK Chen is really trying to reproduce something historic, and so how historic it was or what methods they used, I suppose, will be a bit more of a question or something to follow up on in the review. Anyway, it's got these larger brass bits on here. It's got little hooks which presumably would mount onto a belt or something to adhere the sword. Now this piece seems to be recessed, and so a slight ledge is over, but these slide over the scabbard, so they're not recessed, and there's a more pronounced ledge here and here. This also feels really weighty. Now if I pull this sword up, it's pretty snug in there. That reveals the handle area, and the handle then, if I take the sword out, is small, and I don't know the proper way to hold this. If I hold it down towards the end, I feel like I have more reach, and though it feels a little more cumbersome in the swing. And if I come up here, the sword is actually very balanced, and similar to the other sword, we have similar metallurgical effects. It has a different tip. I'm not sure exactly what type of tip you would call this, but it's got a pronounced ledge, seems well made, and sharpness level is perhaps a little bit duller than on the Heavenly Horse Dao. Either way, it seems like it has an edge geometry that would support putting a really keen edge on it. I just don't know what level of sharpness they're trying to achieve. Again, what seems to be consistent is distal taper. We see one thickness here and another one down here, and it really starts to taper about 2/3 up the blade is where the most pronounced part of the tapering begins. So it's an interesting bit on geometry. This one has much less surface ripple. It's smooth all the way around. Hopefully my camera will show that. I also don't see the same type of attempt at being a hollow ground or slightly removing weight from the blade. That said, it feels certainly controllable in the hand. I don't know to what end. Is this a stabbing weapon, a chopping weapon? I'm not entirely sure, but I do think it certainly feels like it was built with intent, and I feel like I have tip control, and I have no idea how well this will cut or not. It's a very thick blade with a immediate one bevel all the way to the edge, so it's something that a type of blade that I haven't cut with. It does remind me of like a Zatoichi style stick cane sword thing though, and it's interesting. Anyway, I don't have much experience in cutting with these types of things. I will say though, I think the presentation is pretty cool. I like how they stick together. It's very sturdy, and also, you know, very little rattle here. It actually, depending on how much I shake it, does or doesn't, but it's in there pretty good. It doesn't fall out, and I don't know what the expectations are for a sword like this, so more to come. Anyway, if you happen to know context for use, please let me know. The last one to show you that I have here is the Frontier Tang Dao, and in terms of presentation, this is probably the one I'm most familiar with because it bears the most resemblance to a Japanese style katana, which is something I'm a little bit more familiar with, you would say. Overall though, just initial impressions here, I like the transitions. This is recessed, so this pommel area wouldn't be called the kashira on a Chinese sword. I'm not sure exactly what this piece would be called. I just like the presentation here. These are simple copper fittings, but they have some ribs and dimension and area to them that adds some character, I would certainly say, but they're unique. They're not something that I've seen on a bunch of swords, and copper is not a common material used in mass production swords in China. Well, I mean, it's common enough, but I don't often see kind of fittings that highlight it, you might say. So I like the execution here. I like the transitions overall. It's attentive without being overzealous. I mean, they're not perfect, but the sword is also not thousands of dollars. There's also a lanyard that's attached here. These are raised up. This would be normally where the kind of peg would be through, and there's one up here. Transitions as they line up here are pretty good. This side of the scabbard is not recessed though, so you notice that this is recessed. There's no ledge for you to catch your hand on. Over here though on the scabbard, the remainder of these fittings are not recessed on. How historic or ahistoric that is, I do not know. The profile is also different. It has a much wider bevel here, and it appears, if I look in the camera here, as though this is differentially hardened. It has what is similar to a hamon, though I don't know what the Chinese nomenclature would be for it, and it has folded steel with kind of pattern welded effects on it, which are also very nice. And I like this tip here. Very pretty stuff. We have, in a Japanese sword, this blade collar would be a habaki, and a tsuba made of what seems like one thick piece of brass. Though I don't know the Chinese equivalents for the names. Though stylistically, this is more familiar, and the typical things I would check: rattle seems pretty minimal. If I turn it upside down, it doesn't fall out. That blade collar, the habaki area, seems to be doing its job. Where this blade is very different, apart from perhaps the tip, though there were some Japanese style swords made like this. Where this really seems to differ is in the thickness. So what you might notice is at the base here, I would say this is a bit thinner than most katana are, but it tapers very quickly and becomes much thinner. The result is that the blade has a lot more flex than a conventional katana does, and the handle feels perhaps a little heavier, maybe due to the hardwoods or something like that. Anyway, it feels dynamically very, very different to a katana. I have a lot more tip control. It feels a little bit more whippy, anyway, it's different. It's different. It's not what I'm used to. It's familiar, but different at the same time. Anyway, again, I'm not sure historical context for use or what to expect with this. Sharpness-wise, I would say this is akin to the rest, though perhaps a little bit sharper. It seems like some parts of the ledge or the edge are sharper than others in the kind of cutting portion, the top third of the blade. I mean, I can run my finger along it, but if I push, I would certainly cut myself. So sufficiently sharp, but how well it'll hold up to cutting tatami and the like is something that we'll find out in the review. Anyway, it's a very pretty blade in presentation, and I want to see if I can show you. I've got all these fancy lights. You'd think I'd be able to. There we go. You can see some of the effects here. All right, so that was the Frontier Tang Dao. My initial impressions of these swords are actually quite favorable because they capture dynamics in a way that I can't necessarily speak to given my unfamiliarity with the style of weapons, but I can see that they have distal taper. I can feel in my hand that they feel built with intent, feel controllable and nimble and agile and a little bit more elegant than the conventional mass production sword out there. That could be because of their size, it could be because LK Chen is trying to use historical measurements and dynamics to build them. I don't exactly know, though I do say, or think rather, that many mass production swords seem overbuilt, almost like they're meant to be handed to a large man baby who's going to whack trees in the backyard, and they're made to survive that test. This does not feel like it's going to stand up to a lot of beating, but it does feel like an elegant, nice weapon, which oftentimes when I hold historic arms, pieces from antiquity or olden days, if you will, they have a sense of refinement in their hand, which isn't clubbish or brutish. Anyway, I don't know enough about the history to say how closely they are reproducing it or not, but I can say that they feel pretty darn good in my hand. Anyway, the main point of this video was to solicit some feedback. So if you are a Chinese martial arts practitioner, if you know about Dao, if there's something basically that you were wondering about LK Chen blades, or this blade in particular, or any of the other examples I have that might help you know if it's worth your money or not, let me know. What can I cut? What measurements can I take? What tests can I do? And if it's within the realm of possibility and feasibility, I will endeavor to do that. Anyway, that's all I've got so far. Thanks to LK Chen for sending me these review samples. Thank you to those of you out there who are going to respond to this video with some hopefully helpful suggestions on what I can test and do. That's all I've got for you. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.